Okay, time to get started. So my name is Kirsch, and I'm a recent graduate from UC Berkeley from the Molecular Biology PhD program. And I wanted to talk to you guys today about a topic that's very important to myself and many, many others. We want to figure out how to potentially eliminate the challenges associated with uh, climate change, specifically by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in the ground or the sea or elsewhere. To start off with, an important graph to take a look at is the graph that you're seeing here. It's a graph from the Global Carbon Project, and it was built in 2018 to show people how the carbon emissions over the next 100 years will affect the average global temperature. If you see the purple curve, this is the best case scenario. In this scenario, the net CO2 emissions decreases to a level that's either 0 or below 0 between 2050 to 2060. This is, again, the best case scenario. Other scenarios include a warming that gets us closer to 2 to 3 degrees and further warmings that may get us closer to 3 and then ultimately 4 and even 5 degrees. These are temperatures that would be catastrophic for the planet, causing increased sea levels, volatility in the number and intensity of climate disasters, and ultimately leading to a really challenging time for humanity. So we don't want to hit these high temperatures. We want to stay as low as possible to minimize the effects of climate change. If we want to do that, we have to figure out a way to get to a net carbon neutral society by 2050. Now, this isn't going to be easy, and it's not just a matter of actually eliminating the carbon emissions that society produces today. It also means removing CO2 from the atmosphere. If we take a look at the amount of CO2 that we need to get out of the atmosphere into the ground or into water, you can see here a number of different scenarios. Each of these scenarios covers the possible cases of what might happen globally in terms of mitigation, that is, reducing the effects of climate change, and adaptation, which means adapting to the effects of climate change. In this case, we can see that if we want to get to that 2 degrees or less of warming, we need to be able to capture somewhere between 10 to maybe 30 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. And that work needs to start pretty close to right now. So if we're going to try to get somewhere between, let's say, 10 and 30 gigatons of carbon captured per year, how are we going to do that? Well, we need to find a technology that is low cost, easy to turn on and off, has a large contribution to our 10 gigaton per year target, is ready to scale, and is flexible in terms of its implementation. In other words, it shouldn't require a very specific policy. It shouldn't require a very specific geology or geography in order to be implemented, because all of these different requirements reduces the chance that something really revolutionary would be possible. So what kinds of technologies might actually fit these criteria? Well, here's a graph that I think will help shed some light on this problem. What you see here are the costs per ton of CO2 to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And all of these different technologies have different costs, and they also, as you can see on the x-axis, have different potential for the amount of carbon dioxide that can be removed based on this technology. The really interesting technologies that I see here are reforestation / afforestation, which basically means regrowing forests or creating new forests, wetland restoration, soil management, and a few of these other technologies that I'll talk about in a second. If you look at the broad spectrum of available technologies, you'll notice that afforestation, reforestation is the cheapest strategy. One of the reasons why it's so cheap is because it really doesn't involve a lot of technology at all. It involves really just using seeds to grow new trees. And a tree can capture approximately 1 ton of CO2 every 40 years. So that might sound great, but at the end of the day, the amount of carbon that you can capture with this kind of process is fairly limited. As I mentioned before, we want to get to something between 10 to 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide captured per year. If we want to reach those kinds of levels, we're looking at technologies that can get us to this number here, 10,000 megatons, which is the same as 10 gigatons. This afforestation won't get us there by itself. Now, what about wetland restoration? Wetland restoration is a very interesting technology because it not only has a large CDR potential, but the cost of wetland restoration is below this magic number of $100 per ton of CO2 captured. And that is a very promising strategy. One of the key issues with using wetland restoration as our plan for capturing CO2, however, is that it's very policy driven. It really depends on making sure that the politicians in the country of interest actually have the motivation to perhaps reduce their encroachment on wetlands and put money into wetland restoration. However, since this strategy has so much potential, I think that it's something that we ought to consider advocating for as a society. The other thing that's interesting is soil management. Soil management doesn't have the same CDR potential as wetland restoration, and it seems to be, on average, a bit more expensive. But soil management has the benefit of potentially providing a lot of economic benefits to farmers, to other people that are interested in having great soil. So what does soil management really mean? Soil management really means making sure that plants have the right root microbiomes and communities in the soil that allow for the capture of CO2 by microorganisms and by plants and sequestration of that CO2 in the form of fungi and microbes that end up dying and producing more fertilized soil for future generations of plants, and even just capturing the CO2 and storing it deep in the earth for a long, long time. Now, the last couple technologies I want to talk about here are direct air capture and enhanced weathering. They're both technologies that are intriguing because they don't seem to have a clear supply limit. In other words, it's possible that direct air capture and enhanced weathering could be sufficient technologies for capturing all the CO2 that we need to capture on a yearly basis. However, these technologies are fairly expensive, and that's one of the main reasons why they are less likely to be of interest for this grand problem that we need to solve. But if we take a look at the technologies that are most interesting, you notice that a lot of them are actually quite natural. Wetland restoration, soil management, afforestation, reforestation are all technologies that are really not technologies at all. They're more focused on the natural ability of organisms to capture CO2 to use for food. And that takes me to this picture. In this picture might lie the solution to climate change. It might be hard to tell what exactly you're seeing. It looks like a bunch of rocks. But actually, these rocks are covered in millions and millions of microorganisms. And these microorganisms are photosynthetic, and some microorganisms are using the stuff that these photosynthetic microorganisms make in order to survive. There are also fungi and algae that are living in this picture. And what they're doing is they're creating a network and a community that can actually capture a lot of carbon dioxide. How much carbon dioxide? Well, let me show you a few pictures. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the Colorado Plateau in Utah. And specifically, we're looking at the biocrust, or the biological soil crust. That is essentially the ground that you can see here in panel A, and it essentially constitutes about 70% of the ground cover in this area. Biocrusts are held together by chemicals that are produced from cyanobacteria, and in later states, this biocrust can actually contain lichen and mosses. And over here, you can see that the surface textures and colors can vary widely across all of these states. Ultimately, if you look on the left here, this area is what we see when we have bare soil, and then when we have a lightly pigmented cyanobacteria that is present, you'll see what you see in panel D. And then in panel E, we see that there's a biocrust community of darkly pigmented cyanobacteria, mosses, and lichens. So how exactly could these biocrusts serve to mitigate climate change and potentially solve our problem? Well, it turns out that growing biocrusts really means fertilizing the soil like what you see in panel C, with live cultures of cyanobacteria, algae, and fungus. And work has been done to find out how much carbon dioxide could be captured if we just use dry land with cyanobacteria and fungus to capture the CO2 and grow in that dry land. It turns out that we can capture about 3.5 tons of CO2 per year per hectare. If you think about the 10 billion tons of CO2 we need to capture, that's going to require about 2.8 billion hectares. Or another way to look at it is 28 million kilometers squared. Do we even have that kind of space? Well, yes. On the left, you can see a map of arid and semi-arid climates and other dry lands as well, where one might be able to grow these biological crusts. So for example, we can see that there are arid climates in this space around the southwest of the United States, as well as parts of Australia. And in this chart here in the bottom, you can see the aridity zones of the different continents. And it turns out that we'd have to cover the world with about 52% of this biological crust. And that could actually capture all the carbon dioxide that we need to capture on a yearly basis in order to solve our climate problems. Now, it's possible that we could even engineer or improve these biological crusts in their ability to capture CO2 or to stay in one local region. And ultimately, there might be ways to make this process even more efficient by actually using these biological crusts in places where humans might be able to derive economic benefits from the fertile soils that biological crusts can create. So if you're interested in this CO2 problem and want to hear more about solutions that are available, check out the Circular Carbon Network, which is a community of people who are like-minded in their interest in capturing CO2 and using it for useful stuff in society. Another option is to check out the X Prize, and the X Prize specifically is funding a carbon removal project, and that competition actually begins this year and ends in 4 years. There's going to be links in the description, and there's going to be a lot more videos to come from my channel to talk about the carbon removal problem and to try to encourage and advocate for the solution to this problem. And with that, thank you. Please be sure to comment and subscribe or like and rate this video. Again, plenty more to come from myself and my friends in science. Thank you.